Welcome back to another episode of Pro Dignity No Doubt. I am your hostess, Nicole Smith, and today we're diving into a topic that is both challenging, yet I would say very vital to what we're experiencing within culture today. So if you've been here before, you know that I like to zoom out a bit and examine cultural ideas that are shaping the way that we see human value. And today I think we should be peeling back one of the biggest lies of our time. So it's this idea that for us to have a life that would be considered a good life, it must be a life that is completely and utterly free of suffering. So I've chatted about this a bit in the past, a few episodes ago, actually. But I want to do a deeper dive into Western culture's belief that happiness is found in comfort, ease, success, and that struggle itself is something to be avoided at absolute all costs. Because let's be honest, we've all bought it. We have purchased those self-help books with 10 simple steps to a perfect life. Yeah. So social media influencers that are teaching us exactly how to live and optimize every aspect, all the aspects and moments of our life in our day to control our environment, relationships, emotion, body, so that we can live in this seamlessly devoid of hardship existence. And yet, despite our best efforts, somehow pain seems to come. Yeah, super surprising. Expectations are still shattered. Life still takes unexpected turns. It's just the reality. And when that reality does, in fact, hit, it feels a lot like an ambush because we didn't prepare ourselves for it. We're not preparing our children for it, quite frankly. And in this moment, I just want to make it incredibly clear that no matter how much we plan, struggle is an inevitable part of life. But I actually need to go a little bit further. I claim to go a little bit further in that struggle is not just inevitable, it's actually necessary. Because think about it, as a parent, if you're a parent like I am, you know that the deepest joys and purpose that we derive from being a parent comes from those most challenging moments, the exhaustion of rocking a sick baby, the emotional roller coaster I am to understand that is raising a teenager. I'm not there yet, but so essentially patience, additionally, even the patience it takes to guide our children through struggle, pain, failures, our love, connection, purpose, like I said, with our children are deepened in those moments through the struggle, through the pain. But it's not just parenting, it's actually the athlete that pushes past exhaustion to build endurance. It's the entrepreneur failing time and time again, which I know all about as an entrepreneur myself, learning resilience. The advocate that refused to look away from that injustice that just makes most of us too uncomfortable to do anything about. Struggle isn't just an inevitable part of our life. It's actually does something to us. It builds our character, it strengthens our resolve, it deepens our compassion. Actually, I actually argue that it's the birthplace of justice itself. But sadly enough, I'm not immune to it. I actually bought into it throughout different, more challenging parts of my life. As a lot of you well know, my youngest daughter, Cosette, was born with brain damage. And the life that I had planned for her, imagined for her, for myself, quite honestly, was shattered in that moment. The moment that she was born, it was absolutely shattered. And I mentioned this a couple episodes ago, but in the first few months, I spent a lot of time actually listening to music. Not a huge music person, but music therapy was a big part. I really believed it very strongly, not even just for myself, but also for Cosette and my other daughter, my husband. But I would spend hours listening to music in order to process my grief. And there was a song, and I've mentioned it before, by Andy Grammer, and it's called I Wish You Pain. And essentially it's this prayer of pain for his children, because he knew that pain was going to be the birthplace for purpose for his kids, a place for his kids to grow. And it was such a strange sentiment at the time to wish pain upon our children, because it would be a birthplace of purpose in their life. But as I held Cosette, who honestly had a very intimate relationship with pain that even I had experienced, I really couldn't help think about my oldest daughter, Larianne, who had known nothing of but comfort in her life thus far. And so I just thought a lot about how society would tell me that Larianne was the privileged one. But I really realized Cosette was the one with the true privilege. Through her struggle, she was learning resilience, the depth and the meaning in life that my oldest just really didn't have the chance to experience unless it was being falsified in her life by her parents. So it really was a wake-up call for me. And it wasn't just like an individual wake-up call. It was a wake-up call about culture. The culture we live in the West treats struggle as something that isn't just inevitable, but something that we actually can eradicate somehow, as if the very existence of pain is an injustice. And we've reached this point that actually suffering is seen as not just undesirable, but I would suggest and even argue that it sees it as immoral. And really, moreover, I realized that just being on social media, that children like Cosette, my own daughter, actually were a threat to these utopian ideas that a life without pain was this ultimate moral good. And I know this might sound shocking to the more sensible people, but again, online, I saw countless comments on posts that would condemn parents who knew that their children might have disabilities at birth or before birth, that their kids might live with disabilities. They condemn them. And those were parents like me. And it became very clear, this message was clear, that even if there was a remote possibility that struggle may exist for your child, and in turn yourself, that morality demanded a death sentence for these children, for our children. It was just mind-blowing. And it was always translated as mercy. I mean, that, they're going to hurt, they're going to have pain, you're going to suffer, and it's just better off that they be dead. It's good this way. And it wasn't just like the simple, like, pain is bad and we should make choices that alleviate suffering in ourselves and around us. It was more sinister, or at least the impact is more sinister, because of course we shouldn't just like mindlessly walk into struggle if we could avoid it, but that's not how life is. And these thoughts have a real and lasting consequence on society that we're not discussing. And just for a moment, I'd like to take a step back in time and explore a bit about what maybe history speaks on these types of themes. Because as we know, history is full of a lot of lessons. So let's kind of just travel back to 1700s Great Britain. A poor person, their worth was measured by their ability to contribute to the labor force, their ability to work. And if you contribute to the labor force, you had value. If you couldn't, whether it was by age or disability, circumstance, no matter what it was, you were a burden. And poverty, it was such a degree that it was not seen as an unfortunate condition. It was actually a moral failing of the individual with a direct detrimental impact to the collective. And when poverty started to be framed as immoral, it was easy for the solution to become the dehumanization of the poor. Because essentially they were looking at it as like, hey, this person, the more labor output meant that they had greater moral value, and the less moral labor output meant the lesser moral value. So obviously things at the time were a little rocky, and as the population of the highly impoverished grew, there was an increase in pamphlets that were being circulated, laden with these solutions. And even, they were awful. Even some of these solutions, these pamphlets, would suggest that the poor be put through joint stock companies. And if you don't know what a joint stock company is, it's actually reserved for livestock, animals that were going to be eaten and utilized for the benefit of the public. So I want to enter in this individual by the name of Jonathan Swift. He essentially was an Anglo-Irish author and clergyman who was known for the circulation of his own pamphlets. And for the discussion of today, we're actually going to highlight one that if you're a part of my era, you probably actually read this in high school. This is the first time I actually read this as an example of a straight-faced satire. So buckle up. It's a really long title, but it's very important that I read this title so that you kind of understand the premise of what Swift was talking about. So, quote, a modest proposal, this is the name of the pamphlet, a modest proposal for preventing the children of the poor in Ireland from being a burden to their parents or country and for making them a benefit to the public. So a modest proposal was kind of stood out on its own because it was pretty stout things that it talked about. Because really what it had proposed, again, keep in mind it's a satire, that the solution to the era's ills of the time was in fact cannibalism. Yeah, read that right. To kill and eat the yearling babies of the impoverished masses. Again, keep in mind, purely satirical, but in short, Swift's claim in this pamphlet that cannibalistic infanticide benefited all of society and that the poor gained an economic boost from the sale of their children, the death and sale of their children, while the gentry's obligation to ease the burden of the poor was all but erased, which is just wild, wild. Win-win all around, right? But totally barbaric at the same time. But the truth was, like, Swift was exposing a horrifying reality that he was seeing, that essentially a whole swath of society was being dehumanized at an alarming rate, and all for a perceived gain for both the individual and the public at large. And not only was nobody doing anything about it, including the poor themselves, because Swift actually held them accountable too. It was not just the gentry's responsibility, but themselves to do something about it. Everyone just kind of accepted it as truth. It was just a shocking reality. And so when he distributed these pamphlets, it was just the response was, you got to look into the history. It's quite interesting what laid the foundation for him writing this piece. But, we sit and think in just absolute shock that how could they have done this? But if we're honest with ourselves, are we that far removed from that thinking today? Really not. In fact, I'd like to explore some really tough topics that are in modern day that culture would say that I have the right to have this conversation. In particular, let's just focus to start on bodily autonomy. So I'm told, as society tells me, that as a woman, that in order for me to have access to the full rights of personhood, equal moral value within society, to the degree in which men currently enjoy, I must have full ownership of my body without restriction. But I ask the question, if mere ownership over my own body was enough, an individual's body was enough to have this full access, then the act of a man actually raping a woman is justifiable. And just hear this before you get upset. But let's just dive into this concept. We cannot have bodily autonomy is not just about having ownership of our body, because a woman is a person, and a man does not have a right to create whatever type of violence he desires with his body, because bodily autonomy is actually restricted when one person's autonomy intersects with the autonomy of another person of equal moral significance. And let me just emphasize equal moral significance, because that's why when we talk about abortion, we so often hear that a fetus is not a human with equal moral significance to the mother. It's not a human. It definitely doesn't have, it's not human, okay? Yeah. Because if a fetus was actually a human, then aborting the baby actually would be creating a death that kind of goes against a basic moral order that most of us kind of agree on, that you cannot rape, you cannot kill. So it isn't just about this title of human being, it's about whether an unborn life is valuable enough to outweigh the burden that it poses to its parents. Actually, that's precisely what the late abortionist, this was an abortionist saying this, Dr. William Harrison, This is what he meant when he said, quote, the real issue in the abortion debate today is not when life begins, but is it a morally meaningful life? Essentially, Dr. Harrison's point is that we do not even need to explore whether a fetus is a human life at all. In fact, you could just call it a human. It's not even part of it, even though fetus is Latin for offspring, it is a dehumanizing term that is used because it's like not a human, but according to Dr. Harrison, it's irrelevant to the conversation, because the more important point that he was trying to make is whether that the life of the unborn child or the fetus, whatever you want to say, has measurable meaningfulness, aka value. So if Dr. Harrison's statement is accurate and a morally meaningful life actually is something that is to be measured, can be measured, then culture can weigh human value based on its burden or its contributions to society, like they talked about in Swift's error. Because Swift's satire was pointing out that when society has the right to decide when lives are, quote, meaningful or valuable, dignity is totally out the window. Human value, as it's conditional, it's not inherent, right? So we're merely animals. You can't put people through joint stock companies and in fact, measuring human value then becomes a cultural duty. It's a duty to serve the collective interest at the expense of the individual dignity. And this cultural duty actually is exemplified by Princeton ethics professor Peter Singer's words. So I'm going to read this quote. It's pretty sizable, long quote, but it's in regards to disability-based abortion and infanticide. So again, a parent's right to abort their baby or even kill the baby after birth based on a diagnosis of disabilities. So let's read this quote and we'll dive in. Quote, when the death of a disabled infant will lead to the birth of another infant with better prospects of a happy life, the total amount of happiness will be greater if the disabled infant is killed. The loss of for the first infant is outweighed by the gain of a happier life for the second. Therefore, if killing the hemophiliac infant has no adverse effect on others, it should, according to the total view, be right to kill him. So again, the amount of happiness will be greater if the disabled infant is killed. I don't know how we measure happiness in this scenario, or even how you measure adverse effect either. That's very relative. But again, struggle, adverse effect. So yeah, this is a really hard thing to read for a mom that has experienced giving birth to a disabled child. I know for a fact that the world that Singer is proposing would not in fact be happier by any means. Not for the individual, not for the collective, because I know that those with disabilities, by their mere existence, exemplify this truth that purpose and life, happiness, it's not from like this achieving a societal standard of normal or what we would call normal. And that's where pity is derived for those with disabilities, because they're like, well, it's so sad. They're living such a sad life, when they have no clue that the level, our lows might be low, but our highs are so much higher. You have to understand, there's so much joy that our children bring, and that this moral significance or happiness it's not determined by the collective advancement, but by preserving and cherishing individual worth, no matter their quantifiable contribution to culture. And I'll even argue one further, this utopian vision of the world without these unwanted people, these burdensome people, would be devoid of goodness, because the reality is individual worth being inherent, human dignity is the foundation for the pursuit of freedom, justice, and peace around the globe, globally. Because on what grounds do you have to serve someone who is poor, disabled, trafficked, abused, in the foster care system, anyone else a burden in our culture or anywhere else around the world, they're a drain on our resources. And as Singer points out, wouldn't it be a moral good to actually eliminate them because they would be replaced by someone more capable of producing happiness, more value to society? So I just want to borrow a little of the words that Swift spoke in A Modest Proposal, because I argue that today America looks upon the, quote, prodigious number of children in the arms or on the back or at the heels of their mothers, and frequently of their fathers, as the cause of the present deplorable state of the kingdom. And there's a lot of arguments that are out there. They're not even hidden anymore. The amount of people, these unwanted, burdensome children, people, are what makes our world worse. Kill the child within the womb, lest he be born and be forced upon the collective conscience. Our mothers gain an economic boost from the death of our babies. The ruling class, they have no obligation to ease the burden of the poor that they even created themselves. They have no burden whatsoever to ease that. It's all erased. It reduces the impact on our welfare, education, foster care, healthcare, prison systems, does it not? This is progress. We're not the same as Swift. We've moved beyond. We've trudged towards the future. And the reality that we're in actually makes me think of another quote. This is a C.S. Lewis quote that occupies a lot of my space in my brain far too often. But quote, "There's no sense in talking of becoming better if better simply means what we are becoming. It is like congratulating yourself for reaching your destination and defining destination as the place you have reached." We think we progressed past the Swift's era, past the barbaric treatment of the poor, the disabled, the aged. But in reality, we've just changed the language. We still seek comfort at the cost of those we deem burdensome. We post feel-good stories about families raising children with disabilities, but in the same breath, you'll hear, "Oh, man, you're so strong. I could never do that." Yes, you could. It's not like I chose it. It's a reality that presented itself to me. The difference is you don't want to. That's the difference. You don't want to. I don't want to, but it's a reality. And you can't deny the reality because we don't want to be pushed as a culture. We don't want to be stretched. We don't want to be seen. We don't want to see the best parts of ourselves emerge in these moments of struggle. We just don't. We don't want to be the caterpillar becoming a butterfly. And rather than becoming more charitable, we convince ourselves that there is mercy in removing pain, when in reality is a guise for weakness and selfishness, which leads to the most widespread form of injustice in society. And we're going to keep writing it off because we don't want pain. It's simply that comfort has become the ultimate moral truth, like I said at the beginning. And it is to the point at all costs. But let me tell you that in discomfort, this is where we find true joy. Not ease, not comfort, but this transcendent purpose exists by embracing struggle and seeing the beauty in the midst of it. Because pain is going to come anyway. It cannot be eradicated, period. And that's really what my prayer is for society, that we would stop running from hard things, that we would stop discarding those things and those individuals that would challenge us, and that we would remember that dignity is not something to be earned. It must not be earned, because it is something to earn and it is not something that we already possess inherently, then that life is disposable. And if we don't start understanding this, we will continue to repeat history while banging on our chest with false pride. Look at how far we have progressed. It is ridiculous. I know this is super heavy, but we need to keep having this conversation, because how we define human worth shapes everything about the world we create, not just for society at large, but also for ourselves. And if this episode resonates with you, I'd love for you to share it with a friend, leave a review, tag me on social media with your thoughts. My handle is at Nicole M.Y. Smith, literally on any platform. Know that your voice matters in this fight for a culture that values every human life. So if you want to explore these topics further, please subscribe. Don't miss the future episodes. Together, let's challenge the lies that are being presented to our culture. Let's stand for truth and champion the dignity of every human person. Until next time, keep standing, speaking, and defending dignity with no doubt. Thanks a lot.